It's great to be here. Thank you for the very kind introduction and for the invitation. In fact, maybe I'll echo what Cosmo said. It's frankly great to be anywhere at this point, other than my own house, my own four walls of my house. But it is really nice to be out here and chatting with folks again and having a chance to interact. So yeah, this will be roughly 35, 40-minute presentation, but at any point, that you want to dive deeper into something, please feel free to stop me or shout out, or you can wait to the end to ask questions, and we can make this as interactive as possible. So where do we start? I mean, there's not much happening in the world today, so I don't know really what we'll talk about. But let's not forget, amidst everything that's happening, everything out there, all the news that we're reading, all the hoopla, that we are still in a natural disaster. Now, this isn't your typical natural disaster that just kind of sweeps in and wreaks havoc and leaves us to contend with its aftermath. This is what I would say, or what I would call, a protracted natural disaster that seems to be happening over and over and over in waves. Right? But we were told that by the time we got to this point, by the time that we got to this level of inoculations, we'd be at a point where the global economy would be ready to take off. Right? We've definitely seen an enormous rate of double vaccinations, not just here in Canada. It's nice to see folks sitting in the same room, not having to wear masks again. But we've seen an enormous rate of double vaccinations in many countries around the world. You can also add to that the sort of non-lethal infections that give us a bit of a natural immunity to the virus. And so we were told that when we reach this point, we'd be close to achieving what epidemiologists refer to as herd immunity. Do you remember that? Herd immunity, this fabled state where suddenly everything would just get back to normal and we could kind of get on with living our lives again the way we remembered it before COVID paid us a visit. Right? And that would bring with it, of course, normal levels of economic activity. And then once we get those levels, well, then the global economy would just skyrocket as we unleash all the pent-up demand that's been building over the last 2 years. We're pretty much 2 years into this thing. But what's actually happened? What's actually happened out there? Well, what we started to see towards the end of last year was an increase in levels of infection again, right? The highly transmissible Omicron variant led to an increase in infection levels across the world amongst both the non-vaccinated but also the vaccinated. And so you'd have been forgiven for thinking at that point, well, here we go again, right? We're back into this thing. We're right back into it. Time to batten down the hatches, reel things in. We're back to where we were, say, in March of 2020. In fact, you have seen some governments start to reimpose restrictions again. Look at Germany. We know about that here in Canada. Coming from Ottawa, I definitely know about that. But that doesn't actually seem to be playing out on the economic side of things. And I don't use this term lightly, but it seems as though the trajectory of the global economy has kind of decoupled from the trajectory of the virus. Now, it's not happening in all countries and in all sectors, mind you, and we can certainly talk about what economists like to call the K-shaped recovery, but it seems to be happening in enough places that it's making a difference overall at the macro level. It seems to be making a difference at the macro level. Now, you may be saying to yourself, well, what the heck's he talking about? Right? How is it possible that we have, see this pointer, I guess the pointer doesn't work. How is it possible we have this level, these amount of restrictions? Look at these government restrictions across the world. And we're actually talking about a decoupling of the global economy from the virus. We're talking about the alphabet soup of recoveries, right? First it was supposed to be a V recovery, then a U recovery, then a W, and then the dreaded L recovery. Now it's a K-shaped recovery. We're running out of letters to describe the recovery. How can we be talking about recovery at this stage when these are the restrictions that we're still seeing in advanced industrialized economies around the world? Well, it seems that governments have turned their attention away from kind of managing levels of infection towards managing rates of mortality and hospitalization, right? And we're seeing that in the response to Omicron. Most importantly, consumers, you and I, have changed what we buy and how we buy it. Okay, remember that, and we'll come back to that. We've changed what we buy and how we buy it. And so we believe that this adaptation has kind of allowed for the epidemiological data to decouple from the economic data, the financial data. Now, why do I start with the consumer? Why do I start with, the global consumer, what you and I are purchasing? Well, in most economies, if you look at the consumer, that's about 60% of overall economic activity, right? So if you have a good handle on what the consumer is doing, you have a pretty good handle on where the economy is headed. In the United States, it's actually 70% of the economy. So the consumer in the US, the consumer is even more powerful in the world's most powerful economy. Now, there's no better place to look for what's happening with the consumer than retail sales, right? The stuff we buy. And the good news here is that retail sales in G7 economies, at least, is booming. Retail sales in the G7 are up 10%. Now, that's not 10% on the depressed levels of the pandemic. That's 10% on pre-pandemic levels. Let's call it January of 2020, the last time the global economy was supposedly normal. Retail sales up 10% on the last time the global economy was normal. Look, even slow-growing Europe, and we'll talk about Europe because Europe's dealing with a few other issues now. Retail sales in Europe up 6%, 7%. That's pretty good. What about here in Canada? Well, in Canada, we've seen some reimposition of restrictions, and we know about that, as we mentioned. But even in Canada, retail sales up 11% from January of 2020. 11% from the last time the economy apparently was functioning properly. Retail sales are even up 11% on top of that. But the real star performer here, like the real star, the real leader here, is the US consumer. Look at that US consumer. Retail sales in the United States up by a phenomenal 23%. 23% on pre-pandemic levels. And that's notwithstanding some decline that we started to see towards the end of last year. Now, you may be saying to yourself, whoa, hold on. I remember that consumer, right? I remember that consumer from the global financial crisis. I definitely remember the US consumer taking out a whole bunch of debt, refinancing their mortgages just to spend more money. Is that the same US consumer we're really counting on to pull us out of this thing? Is that the consumer that we're looking at for signs of where the global economy is headed? And I want to be very clear about something. The consumer in the United States today is a very different US consumer. Savings rates in the United States have jumped from about 3% back then in 2008 to just over 7% now. Debt to disposable income in the United States peaked at 165% during the global financial crisis. That was the worst among OECD economies. And just to give you a sense of what that means, it basically means that for every dollar of disposable income that the US consumer had, they actually owed $1.65. Peaked at 165% in 2008. That's now down to very comfortable levels. In fact, if there's any consumer I'm concerned about, and I'm happy to talk about it, it would be the Canadian consumer, if we're talking about debt. If we really want to talk about consumers that are saddled with debt, I think we should talk about the Canadian consumer. So it's clear that this is a very different consumer in the United States. The consumer in the US has done a good job deleveraging. And so what that means is that we're actually not seeing more debt-fueled spending. So then the question becomes, does this have momentum? Like, can the consumer keep it up? And I think it's especially an even more important question given that we're starting to see government transfer payments here in Canada and in the United States being scaled back. So is there momentum? Can the consumer in the US keep that up? The short answer is yes, for one simple reason: pent-up demand. Pent-up demand. The consumer in much of the advanced economies, much of the OECD economies, came into the downturn with a whole bunch of pent-up demand already, deferred purchases for one reason or another, right? And then the pandemic hit, and unfortunately a lot of people lost their jobs, and some people didn't lose their jobs. When we went into lockdown, there was suddenly a whole lot less stuff that you could spend your money on, right? Vacations were canceled, we weren't going to restaurants anymore, we didn't have to commute to and from the office. And so this led to a huge bump in what we call cash on hand. In fact, if you look at what economists refer to as demand deposits, it's basically the amount of money you take out of your paycheck, throw it into your checking account without even thinking about it to cover, your utilities, your credit card bill, your other kind of day-to-day expenses. If you look at these demand deposits, there's been an enormous pileup over the last little while. A huge pileup over the last little while. In Canada, that amount adds up to 7% of our entire economy. 7% of our entire economy. In the US, it's closer to 14, 15% of their economy. So think about it this way. It's like we all just got, over the course of the pandemic, a 7% bonus deposited directly into our checking account. That's huge. That's huge. That's an enormous wall of cash that can wash into that, in about half of the world, that can wash into the global economy just like that, pretty much overnight. That's enormous. I mean, that's a lot of spending power, potential spending power. And that's notwithstanding the increased levels of infection that we've started to see, or that we started to see towards the end of the year, and now we're concerned about with the so-called B1 strain of Omicron. And so it's why we say that we do expect this spending to continue, even as you see households have started to draw down on some of that early pandemic savings. So you've seen that spending has started to go up. Households are getting comfortable that we don't need to stock away the money the way we've been doing it, and have started to draw down on some of those early pandemic savings. Even then, we see there's still a whole bunch of that gap between the solid line and the dotted line. That's your excess savings. That's all that excess cash just sitting in checking accounts. So it's good to know that, and you can see the comparison with where things were prior to the crisis. Actually, in Canada, it's even more stark, where we actually had negative cash on hand before the pandemic. Gets back to the debt issue I mentioned. So it's good to know that the consumer has a bunch of dry powder on hand. But if we're really going to get out of this thing, in a really sustainable way, we need to know that the global economy is firing on more than just one cylinder, right? The consumer is important, it's true, but the consumer can be fickle, right? And we see that now with news around Ukraine. The consumer is kind of getting jittery all over the world. So we need to know that the global economy is firing on more than just one cylinder. So let's take a look at other parts of the economy, other components of GDP, as economists like to refer to it. Let's look at the trade side of the economy. If there's any part of the economy that you would expect to take a little bit longer to recover, it would be the trade side, as governments are understandably reluctant to allow for cross-border movements when we're in the midst of a once-in-a-generation pandemic. And so most economists actually expected to see a more drawn-out recovery when it comes to trade, in terms of trade, similar to the one that we saw following the global financial crisis in 2008. But in fact, global trade snapped back pretty quickly after the initial onset of the pandemic. And global exports have now more than fully recovered. Global exports have more than fully recovered. In fact, if you look at global shipments, and I'm talking physical shipments here, I'm stripping out the pricing impact because we know what's happened on the pricing side, and I'm going to talk about that. Just physical shipments, global trade is up 9.8% from before the crisis. Physical volume shipments are up almost 10% from the last time the global economy was quote-unquote normal. Now, that number actually masks a bit of an uneven performance, where you see exports out of developed economies up by just over 5%, about 5.3%, whereas exports out of emerging markets are up by almost 20%, 19.3% on pre-pandemic periods. Exports out of emerging markets, and remember that, and we'll come back to it. Exports out of emerging markets up 19.3% from before the pandemic. And that's an imbalance that's directly related to the pandemic, where advanced economies saw more widespread lockdowns than what they saw in emerging markets in a contained or in a coordinated effort to help contain the pandemic. So if you add up the consumer that we talked about, together with this trade story, and all the government spending that we've been seeing over the last 2 years, together with easy liquidity conditions that have been driving momentum in terms of business investment, you'd sort of think we were back to normal. Global economy should be kind of back to normal at this point, right? Maybe not. What the heck's happening here? Why has trade struggled so much since last spring? Why have global supply chains become so ensnared? Well, part of the answer can be found not in the supply chains themselves, ironically, but in the manufacturing processes that companies have set up over the last number of decades in the name of customer centricity and enhanced productivity. Right? Toyota created, or at least popularized, the use of the just-in-time manufacturing process for domestic suppliers who cooperate quite closely. But today's supply chains stretch across the world, and subcontractors are often kept secret from others along the supply chain, to say nothing of the consumer at the end of the chain. And so combining this just-in-time manufacturing process with these low-trust, long-distance supply chains in some ways helped set the preconditions for what it is that we're seeing today. This type of a setup isn't meant to accommodate any serious disruptions at all. This is a setup that you put in place when everything's running smoothly, right? Just in time. Things come in, they go out, they come in, they come out. You have to ensure that things are running smoothly. It is not meant to accommodate any disruption. Perfect. So enter 2020. The pandemic hits and production absolutely collapses, either intentionally as producers slash their sales forecasts, or unintentionally as COVID countermeasures force workers to stay home. And for a very brief period of time, that actually made sense. Right? We weren't buying anything anyways. I wasn't buying anything, except, masks and sanitizer, but it didn't make a difference to us. But that was a very brief period of time, because suddenly, governments, central banks from around the world unleashed this wave of massive and unprecedentedly coordinated public stimulus measures. Right? Interest rates are cut to basically zero, in some cases actually below zero. Central banks load up their balance sheets, injecting huge amounts of liquidity into the system. And the world's most powerful governments put into place these fiscal stimulus measures that we have never seen before. In fact, according to some measures, fiscal and monetary support into the economy was the equivalent of 20% of the world's economy. 20% of global GDP injected back into the system in a very short period of time. But because we were in lockdown, we couldn't actually spend that money. Well, there were a lot less ways to actually spend that money, right? As we said earlier, that money that used to go into leisure and hospitality services, into transportation, was either put away for a rainy day, or what? Or it went into ordering more stuff online, right? Remember, we changed what we bought and how we bought it. How many of you converted that annual vacation into a new backyard deck? The daily commute to the office into a computer upgrade, or a fancy audiovisual setup at home, or something for the kids, right? We changed what we bought and how we bought it. So we basically went from 0 to 100 in a very short period of time, and good suppliers just couldn't handle it. Look, the reality is that today, supply chains are so intricate, they're so interconnected, that I'll bore an analogy here, but just the small flap of a butterfly wing somewhere along the supply chain can lead to a tsunami effect somewhere else. And so imagine the impact further upstream of this incredible surge in consumer demand that we started to see. Suddenly, when people started buying stuff that they never bought before. The world's stocks of raw materials stretched beyond capacity. You see the impact on pricing. I apologize. It's a bit of an old chart. It was updated last week. You would certainly see a different pricing picture on energy and agriculture now in light of what's happening in Ukraine, but same picture, same idea. The world's stocks of raw materials stretched beyond capacity. Think about oil and gas, industrial metals like copper, right? The metals that are used for electric vehicle batteries. And so what does this shortage of raw materials then mean for those factories that are assembling those intermediate goods, the key components that are going into the final products that you and I are consuming at an ever-increasing rate, at this frantic rate, right? It also doesn't help that we start to see COVID-related factory closures in key parts of Southeast Asia, namely Vietnam, Thailand, Malaysia. And this is where, to be honest with you, a zero COVID policy can be as disruptive as it is ineffective. And I think that that's something that the Chinese are starting to learn. Those of you who've been out to buy a car or a computer or a PlayStation for your kids over the last little while, you can speak to the delays in microprocessors, right? Chips. The average wait time for chip deliveries to factories has more than doubled, from about 12 weeks before the pandemic to almost 26 weeks on average today. It's even longer for so-called trailing edge chips like microcontrollers, which are absolutely key in vehicle assembly, and it's why the automakers are suffering so much and struggling so much to keep up. In addition to the supply-demand imbalances that the global economy is dealing with, we also need to consider that as shipping velocity rises, the global shipping industry is struggling to keep pace, right? Container and vessel shortages have put a strain on the shipping industry. It's led to port congestion, shipping backlogs, slower turnaround times, and rising costs, right? And events like last year's blockage of the Suez Canal, the flooding in BC, the blockades at the Canada-US border, the war in Ukraine now, certainly don't help matters. Right? Because, you know, this is all one integrated trading system. Adding to the problem is that when ships arrive late, cargo operations, turnaround schedules get thrown completely out of whack, right? And that has reverberations right through the supply chain into areas like freight rail, trucking, warehousing, right? Shipping is only actually part of the global transportation bottleneck. Trade volumes are unlikely to get back to where they were last spring until transportation and logistics headaches further inland are cleared. In the US, we're seeing now not only a shortage of rail cars, we're seeing a shortage of warehouse spaces. And we'll talk about that because that's super relevant for you guys. But as the impacts of the virus abate and restrictions ease, and while I'm not an epidemiologist, the experience of countries like South Africa who were hit by Omicron early tells us that there's a relatively quicker exit from peak than was the case under previous waves or previous strains. And so as restrictions ease, likely by mid-year, some of those dollars that we talked about flowing into consumer durables are going to start to flow back into experiences, right? Services, and that'll help ease demand pressures, while related factory closures should start to ease. And that will help alleviate some of the supply constraints. And so that should help sort out some of the disruptions in supply chains. Again, we expect probably by mid-year, so we're getting closer to that point. Additionally, we don't actually think that the situation in global shipping reflects structural constraints, where we're running up against fundamental capacity issues in the world of shipping. We actually instead think it's more of a frictional situation. What does frictional mean? Well, what it basically means is that we do have enough capacity in shipping. It's just that that capacity for now is parked in all the wrong places. Let me explain. If you have emerging markets exporting at the pace that I mentioned earlier, up almost 20% on pre-pandemic levels, shipping huge amounts of stuff to our markets, while we haven't been able to ship back at nearly the same pace, right, 5%, for a number of reasons, then what you're going to be left with is a whole bunch of stranded assets, stranded containers, stranded ships, stranded vessels in all the wrong places, right? A whole bunch of stranded assets in all the wrong places. This strong import demand that we're seeing in North America, in particular, in the US and Canada, has made it more profitable for shipping companies to transport cargo from Asia to North America instead of the other way around, right? And so that's part of the problem now. It's getting these empty ships, these empty containers back to where they're needed in order to help facilitate global trade going forward. In fact, the number of empty ships leaving ports in North America, the ports of New York and Los Angeles, has surged over the pandemic. Listen to this, cargo companies are actually choosing to skip the congested loading process in North America, send their ships across the ocean totally empty so that they can get on to more profitable routes in Asia. So that's exacerbating a lot of the problem that we're dealing with now. So again, we don't actually think that this is a permanent problem here, and we expect that we're going to start to see the light at the end of the tunnel in the second half of the year. Of course, again, Ukraine is a risk here, especially when it comes to commodities, so ag commodities, natural LNG, many of the metals, key metals, machinery and equipment, and we'll talk a little bit more about that. But you can already start to see hints of this strain dissipating, with key shipping rates starting to come down, albeit still at high levels, but they're starting to come down nonetheless. So we expect by mid-year, depending on what happens on the Ukraine front, we expect by mid-year things should start to loosen up a little bit. But no doubt that's a long time to wait if you are a manufacturer waiting on an order backlog, or if you're an exporter looking to get your goods to market. And there is certainly a risk that it could be even longer if the impacts of Omicron persist, or we start to see, as I said, a new strain, like this B1 strain, and we don't get that rotation in demand that we're expecting towards services. Ongoing COVID-related factory disruptions, port closures, particularly as a result of China's zero COVID strategy, could also pose a risk. Again, Ukraine, another big risk to our forecast, and it's something that we're sorting out as we speak. And that could potentially mean that transport and logistics bottlenecks, headaches, are going to be with us for even longer. So what are some solutions? I mean, we're out there talking to our customers about potential solutions. What are some solutions that companies can start to look to? Well, governments certainly have a role to play here, and the recently approved Ocean Shipping Reform Act in the United States should help support that country's outbound trade by preventing shipping companies from refusing to load products onto their boats for export to Asia. In the UK, the government there has introduced temporary visas last September to deal with the worker shortages. And we'll talk a little bit more about worker shortages in a sec. In addition, we expect to see increased investment in new factories and distribution centers and re-engineering of existing ones to help address the shortfall in storage spaces near ports and to help accommodate the rise in global e-commerce going forward. This is going to reduce port congestion. It's going to help boost supply chain resilience. In fact, you can see that over the course of the pandemic, there has been a steady increase in the construction of warehouses in the United States, and we very much expect that to continue. In fact, I would say that we probably expect that to increase going forward. And we can talk more about that. Additionally, warehouse automation, robotics, the use of smart technologies like blockchain should help support productivity, the rise of productivity in supply chains going forward. Improved analytics is going to play a role here. And so this is about collecting and analyzing huge amounts of data like container usage and location, port congestion, vehicle movements, driver and raw material shortages, rather than just simply boosting or building supply chains based on these antiquated rules of thumb that we used to. Many companies are also starting to look to redesign and standardize their products and their manufacturing equipment in order to move away from country-specific production so that they can actually shift production from one location to the other or even one continent to the other should the need arise. For more immediate impacts, we expect companies to adopt new supply chain risk management practices. And what that means is that we do expect to see a shift in business models away from just-in-time delivery towards just-in-case inventory and shifting to multiple sources of material, specifically raw materials. So while supply chain management was once mostly, in fact exclusively about cutting costs, companies now are having to look to balance kind of the competing interests of enhancing resilience, managing their carbon footprint, and at the same time, keeping costs down, managing costs. Another solution that's getting a lot of airplay these days is a rollback of one of the main tenets of globalization, often referred to as reshoring or backshoring or nearshoring. And to be honest with you, this is one that I have a bit more of an issue with when I look at things over the long term, because we believe that the quest for profit maximization in a free market make global supply chains an inevitability over the long run, and globalization unlikely to reverse course, barring massive structural changes to the global trade paradigm, right? As long as one company benefits from sourcing its factors of production at their lowest cost, others are going to have to follow, right? It's just the market rule. In addition, restructuring these complex supply chains that spread, these production chains that spread across countries and continents, takes time and money, lots of money, and may not actually yield the most efficient outcomes. What more likely we're expecting to see is globalization adapting in order to stay alive. And this is going to have a more nuanced impact on global trade. A redefinition of what we consider to be strategic industries to include things like PPE and medical equipment, trade infrastructure, critical industrial technologies like chips, along with the old standards like military technology and energy infrastructure and a few others. The bigger problem, as I mentioned earlier, and I think would be relevant to some folks in the room, is this. Assuming you can actually order more stuff, let's say you can get your hands on more stuff, and somehow magically you even find a container to put that stuff in. And then lo and behold, there's even a ship there sitting and waiting for you to load your container on. Then what? Who's offloading it? All right? Port throughput is fixed in nature. It's fixed by geography, but it's fixed by capacity. So while we may succeed in getting more goods to port, our ability to offload those goods has to keep pace, and unfortunately, it hasn't. If we have more stuff coming in, we need more workers to take that stuff off the ships. And it's why you may have seen a couple of months back the critical ports of Long Beach, Los Angeles, add shifts, move to 24/7 scheduling. But labor shortages have now become a bigger, more critical issue in other parts of the supply chain. I mentioned earlier, trucking, warehousing services, freight rail. In the US, turnover rates for truck drivers is between 80 and 90%, largely based on poor working conditions. We know about the shortage of truck drivers in Europe, in the United Kingdom in particular, and we're seeing a surge in job posters for those types of positions in the UK and in Europe. And so what that means is we should expect to see labor costs, and when I say labor costs, I'm talking about wages, salaries, benefits, even working conditions, go up over the next little while. So labor is clearly another issue that the global economy has to deal with now. There's a bit of a shift in power that's happening, and we're very cognizant of that. When the pandemic hit, unemployment skyrocketed. In the US, we hit unemployment of 15% pretty much overnight. Canada wasn't far behind. But now, suddenly, unemployment is back down to where it was before the pandemic. And labor force participation, at least here in Canada, is back to pre-pandemic levels. And so as growth surges, and growth is continuing to surge, companies are finding it harder and harder to not only attract, but retain those critical workers, that key talent, that skilled labor that they need in order to meet their growing customer demands going forward. In fact, that's exactly the feedback that we're getting from our customers. There's a growing frustration out there that employment conditions have tightened so much that in some cases, anecdotally, we're hearing of staff leaving for opportunities elsewhere doing the exact same work for up to 40% more money. It's got to give you some sense of the tightness that we're dealing with, of the imbalances that we're dealing with inside of the labor market. And it's something that's maybe a longer term structural conversation, but it's something that we've got to, and it does depend on demographics, for example, but it's something we've got to deal with. I'm happy to chat about that in the Q&A. So, pent-up demand, rising input costs, choke supply chains, labor constraints. Who do you think is going to pay for that? We're going to pay for it, the consumer. Right? And we're already starting to see some of those price increases pass through, particularly on the goods side, and specifically with respect to bigger ticket items like cars, like appliances, consumer durables, right? And so it's no longer just upstream prices. It's not even the intermediate prices anymore. It's right down to the final prices that you and I are paying at the till, and it's most notably in the United States, but starting to happen here too in Canada. And it's showing no signs of letting up. If you're looking at early warning indicators, like producer prices, it's not letting up. But I think the real risk for me here, to be very honest with you, is more the risk around what economists refer to as second round effects on inflation via higher future wage growth. Let me explain. If inflation expectations take hold, and people start expecting that it's going to cost them a little bit more money to maintain the same quality of life, maybe just increase their quality of life just a little bit, they're going to ask their employers for more money, right? Because employees, consumers, companies live or report in a nominal world, but employees, consumers, live in a real world. They have to adjust their wages for inflation. Right? So they're going to start asking for more money. And given the pressures in the labor force that we just talked about, do you think that companies are in a position to say no? And that's when we run the risk of falling into an inflationary cycle, right? You ask for a little bit more money because it's costing you more to live. Fair enough. Your boss complies, says, fine, here you go, gives you a small raise. There's now more money in the system, chasing the same amount of goods and services, actually maybe less goods and services because of supply chain issues. So that bids up prices. Prices go up, cost you more to live, you got to turn around and ask for more money. You ask for more money, you get more money. You see how this works, right? And it goes on and on and on. And that's the inflationary cycle, those second round effects that economists talk about. And we're already starting to see some of that, frankly, happen around the world. Trash collectors in Brighton in the UK, factory workers in the United States. Germany's biggest labor union asking for a 5.3% wage increase. 5.3% wage increase in a country that is absolutely obsessed with price stability. Closer to home, I saw last week that Target raised its minimum pay to $24 an hour. And so as a result, employment costs are going up. In the United States, average hourly earnings are up by almost 6%. In Canada, it's not as dramatic. It's up by about 3% here. But it's something we need to keep an eye on. And it's what's prompted the IMF to warn central bankers in Canada, in the United States, in the UK, in Europe, to be very, very vigilant against rising energy and other costs feeding through to higher wages and core prices. So, will inflation throw the recovery off? Will inflation throw the recovery off? Well, if the pandemic loosens its grip, which it seems to be doing, helping to alleviate the supply chain problems that we talked about and leading to that shift in demand, right, away from goods, more toward services, then we should start to see inflation cool a little bit. And as economists are really fond at saying, the cure for high prices, the best cure for high prices usually are high prices, right? Higher prices, greater profit margins encourage greater supply, either from existing businesses or new entrants that are looking to kind of cash in on the good times. And we're already starting to see some of that play out. But if consumer prices continue to soar, as the war in Ukraine raises food and energy prices, that could very well cut into that fat 7% bonus that we talked about earlier for Canadian consumers. Cut into consumers' wealth and ability to spend. Right? That could lead to market instability, would make it more difficult for companies to plan in an environment like that where prices start to take off. My concern, however, my real concern, rather is not on inflation. I mean, it is worrying and it's painful, right? It's painful when we go to the pumps. It's painful when we go, pick up a loaf of bread or we have to go do our grocery shopping. My real concern here, though, comes from how central banks might respond to inflation or what central bankers might even do in order to prevent inflationary expectations from taking hold. G7 central bankers, you can bet, are keeping a very close eye on the risk of falling into that inflationary cycle that we talked about. They've started to take steps into this new monetary regime. We saw yesterday the Bank of Canada raise interest rates. Most central banks, most of the major central banks, have started to either end quantitative easing or signal the end of quantitative easing and allow the maturing assets on central bank balance sheets to gently roll off without replacing them. So in some ways, that very gently pulls money out of the system. But, while the analogy I always like to use is we may have stopped filling the punch bowl, but the real test for markets is going to come when central bankers turn the lights on and start calling cabs for their guests. Right? Interest rate liftoff. If it's not a term that you've heard of before, you're going to start hearing a lot more about it now. Interest rate liftoff and a more active shrinking of central bank balance sheet, either through asset sales or what's known as quantitative tightening, is not going to come without consequence, especially if it happens too fast and if central bankers go too far, if they're too jittery, they're too worried about inflation and they go too far. And it's precisely the reason for all the monetary policy telegraphing that you're hearing these days. Look, Chair Powell yesterday in his testimony to Congress, he came out and said that the US Fed will raise interest rates by 25 basis points at our next meeting. He came out and said it weeks in advance. I mean, that's not even policy telegraphing. That's basically just giving you the answer sheet. Right? Markets don't have to guess anymore. We know what's going to happen in March. Beyond that, not so sure. There's some concerns that maybe there's a 50 basis point hike in May. And so central bankers are going to have to be very, very careful managing market expectations here. Because up until now, cheap money has been letting governments spend. Well, it's been letting governments borrow, and that's been letting governments spend. It's been underpinning historic stock market valuations, abundant credit to the private sector. Right? Since the collapse of Lehman Brothers, we've had now more than 1,000 global interest rate cuts. More than 1,000 global interest rate cuts. Central bankers have injected more than $23 trillion into the global economy through various quantitative easing programs. So a sudden change to that could be painful. It would definitely hit equity markets, hit credit markets, likely even hit real estate markets in certain countries, perhaps Canada, take the shine off of certain commodities, lead to currency instability. But the concern for me is that higher real yields are going to lead to higher borrowing costs and make more risky assets relatively less attractive in financial markets. And this could very well expose over-leveraged corporates who've spent the last number of years stocking up on unproductive debt beyond what's sustainable. Right? And it's why we like to say in financial markets that it's, when the tide is in, it's a party for everybody. It's when the tide goes out that you start to see who is swimming without shorts. Right? So there are concerns around these over-leveraged corporates who have done themselves no favor over the last couple of years, taking on this additional debt in addition to what they really needed to get by to get them through the pandemic. It could also potentially reverse capital flows into emerging markets, many of who themselves have been experimenting with larger budget deficits, unconventional monetary policy. And so, if the global financial crisis in 2008 was an effect of Greenspan's response to the 2001 tech wreck, as many people say that it was, I worry about the scale of the consequences to the extraordinary amount of liquidity that we've been pumping into the system over the last little while. And so central bankers face a terrible conundrum at this point, and it's made even worse, even more difficult by what's happening in Ukraine. You raise rates too late or too timidly, and you leave future generations to have to wrestle inflation to the ground. You move too aggressively, too fast, too far, and you risk setting off a taper tantrum similar, maybe worse, than the one that we saw back in 2013. As at the same time, the war in Ukraine is leading to weaker confidence and demand erosion. So central bankers are in a very rough spot right now, and it is important that we keep an eye on them. For me, when we're out talking to customers, when I'm talking to my own board, and we're asked the biggest risk, and everybody's focused on inflation, everybody's focused on labor, this one to me is one to keep an eye on, the financial risks, because it'll impact all of us. So, yeah, that's basically how we see it. Right? The COVID-fueled uncertainty created these expectations of a long, drawn-out recovery. But actually, growth is booming. Growth is booming, and it's caught many of us off guard. So much so that I would say that the strength of the global economy is actually at the root of a lot of the stresses that we're dealing with today. Right? Supply chain issues, wage issues, inflation. It's actually the strength of the global economy that's kind of at the source of a lot of these risks. We need to make sure that supply chains can keep up. So companies need to watch capacity and invest in order to create that capacity. In fact, if there's anything I would want you to take away from this presentation, it's the need for companies to invest at this particular point in the economic cycle. Right? The need for investment in infrastructure, investment in warehouses, plant upgrades. And actually, that's a good thing for the construction industry. Right after a slowdown early in the pandemic, it seems that investment in non-res construction has to pick up over the next little while. It will pick up over the next little while. Companies have no choice. Their capacity has to keep up with demand. Material shortages and inflation is absolutely going to be an issue. Soaring gas and electricity costs are adding to pressures already experienced by construction companies. Energy-intensive industries like steel, concrete, cement are passing on the impact of higher prices, and again, that's being made worse by the situation in Ukraine. But this should ease, and it should be a motivator for your investment. Invest in your plant, property, and equipment. Invest in your people. Invest in what it is that makes your business run. Invest in what makes your business unique. And that, we believe, is going to give you the competitive edge that you need to meet the oncoming demand, to face the oncoming demand that we see happening over the next couple of years.